Hi everyone. So yesterday I went and saw The Odyssey by Christopher Nolan. This is his 13th film, and after the success of Oppenheimer back in 2023, he essentially got a blank check to make The Odyssey, which for those of you who don't know, Christopher Nolan actually back in the early 2000s was set to direct Troy, but this was then given to Wolfgang Peterson. And in Nolan's own words, he didn't end up taking on that film because he felt like he was way in over his head. And I think at this point in his career, he is at a point where directing a Homeric epic is something that he can take on. And, to no one's surprise, it's a pretty good film. And I'll get into my sort of like full review and my full thoughts on the film. But before that, a quick note about spoilers. So because The Odyssey is essentially a 3,000-year-old story, I will touch upon some general events or some famous stories from the Odyssey, but I won't go into too much specifics about how they're executed, just to keep the review as spoiler-free as possible. So Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is laid out in a pretty non-linear structure, which makes sense, A, because that's how the original Odyssey is also written out, but then also because Nolan famously employs a lot of non-linear narrative techniques in his other films as well. So he does seem like the perfect director for a story told in this fashion. And the way that he adds these scenes almost like vignettes or like snippets of memories works very well. It does sort of feel like a oral tradition where someone is kind of giving you a bit of one story and someone else is giving you another story, and it's all like coming together as part of a larger thing. And just overall, at no point does it feel disjointed, even though there's a lot of back and forths in terms of the timeline. The story is very cohesive, even if you've never actually read The Odyssey or if you're coming in completely blind. I also thought the writing and dialogue was very well done, and this is something that has been a bit controversial because this adaptation of The Odyssey uses a lot of very casual modern language. Nolan primarily employed the translations by Emily Wilson, and then to a lesser extent, translations by Robert Fagles and by E.V. Rowe as well. While Fagles and E.V. Rowe did have some more archaic formal language in their translations, Wilson's translations have been famous for how casual they are. And the reason I don't have a problem with that is because the Odyssey and the Iliad are both oral stories. They've been passed down through generations, and it very much so makes sense that the language that you're using to tell them now is the language of now as well. I don't see it as an inherent issue that the characters in the film are, talking with an American accent or talking in a 21st century speak, because this is a timeless story at the end of the day. I also thought the visual storytelling was excellent. The way that gods and their powers are generally depicted, especially the higher gods like Zeus and Poseidon, was very well done. And I would also like to shout out the underworld scene in this film, which was done in a way that's pretty unique. I haven't really seen a lot of adaptations depict the underworld and depict Hades like that, but it was also one of the most effective scenes in the film. And there's this motif of being chased by ghosts that was done in a very interesting way. In that scene, really had me hooked and added a lot to the overall narrative or the lesson in this version of the Odyssey too. Also, like, the dialogue and the writing wasn't a problem at all, partially because of just how good the performances were. Even though Matt Damon was talking in somewhat of a Boston accent at times, his performance itself was so good. Literally everyone just showed up, did their best. There wasn't a single false note in terms of the performances. Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Zendaya, Lupita Nyong'o, Charlize Theron, John Bernthal, Elliot Page, John Leguizamo, everyone that I can think of that was in this film. Also star-studded cast, but literally everyone was so good. And of course, as a Nolan film, this was a very visceral, beautiful experience that really made full use of the medium of cinema in every way possible. There's a strong sense of mise-en-scene here where you get these very vast, desolate landscapes imbuing a sense of isolation in a lot of the scenes. And at the same time, in scenes like the flashback to the Trojan horse, there's this deep sense of claustrophobia that's further fueled by how well shot that scene is. You see all of the like characters in these all black outfits, just these sweaty bodies overlaid on top of each other, squeezing for like an inch of extra space. It's such a dirty, grimy, intense scene that really, like, I was holding my breath while I was watching that. And just so many scenes like this, right, where just the overall look and feel adds so much to the overall experience. Also, obviously, I can't go on any longer without shouting out Nolan's longtime collaborator and cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema, who's done the cinematography on a lot of his other films like Interstellar and Dunkirk as well. And of course, he was on his A game as well. Just such beautiful, colorful, well-structured, well-executed shots. Plus, watching it in the like IMAX aspect ratio was just an incredible experience. I also want to shout out the insane stunt coordination, especially towards the climax of the film. This isn't a very action-packed film, I would say. There are definitely like big periods where it's mostly like dialogue, and not to say that those parts aren't just as thrilling, but the action scenes in this film really like brought me back to those Batman trilogy days, right? Like just some really good hand-to-hand combat, really good stunt coordination throughout every action scene in the film. And of course, some great visual effects, both practical and CGI. So for instance, the Cyclops in the film, A, solves the one-eye problem in depicting, one-eyed creatures in film in such an interesting way. I don't think I've ever seen that before. The way they kind of like place his eye on his face and make it look natural, but also so eerie at the same time was so clever. But also the fact that this was like a huge animatronic, and the fact that this wasn't entirely CGI'd is so impressive to me. Like really, you'll have to see it to believe it. The Cyclops scene is such a cool experience to watch in the cinema. Also, the scenes with Cersei were so cool because, I don't know, like Chris Nolan isn't really much of a horror director, but I do feel like he could do a really good body horror film. There's some body horror stuff that happens which was so unsettling. There were people all around me just gasping like when that happened, and it was so insane. I do have some reservations about how they dealt with Cersei's character, which I'll discuss like in the end of the review, but that scene itself was one of the most memorable ones in the film. And both of these scenes, the Cyclops and the scenes with Cersei and so many others, were further improved upon by the excellent sound design. And of course, Ludwig Göransson, the GOAT, was just at his peak behavior. Such a beautiful score that elevated so many scenes. Göransson has never really done a bad score in his life, and this one is no exception. Okay, I've said a lot of things that I liked about the film, and there really is a lot to like about the film, but I wouldn't say it's perfect. I do have like one small-ish reservation with the film. There are some scenes that are cut out from this adaptation of the Odyssey, which inherently isn't a problem, right? Like even across a 3-hour runtime, adapting such a long poem and keeping everything isn't really possible. So things that were cut out include, for instance, the famous nobody pun that Odysseus does with the Cyclops early on in the story. And then towards the end, there's this famous olive tree test, which I don't want to go into too much detail in case you do want to read the book. That was cut out as well. Also, most of the scenes with Cersei, or like even the significance of Odysseus's interactions with Cersei, were cut short significantly. And inherently, again, that's not a problem, right? Like this happens, things get left on the cutting room floor all the time. But the issue with it is that it kind of forgoes a lot of depth that Odysseus's character could have had, because cutting out these scenes specifically does not allow the audience to realize that Odysseus canonically is supposed to be a very cunning, scheming character as well, which we really don't see a lot of in this film, and leaves out a dimensionality to the character, which I feel like is very foundational to the legend of Odysseus as well. And at the same time, leaving out the whole thing with Cersei was just disappointing, because I love Cersei's story in its own right, and I felt like it didn't really do a lot of justice to her character. I will say though, Samantha Morton is excellent in her portrayal. She is so good. In a star-studded cast, she is just another excellent actor who does an amazing performance. She has a very small part in the film, but she's really, really good. And overall, I'll say this is a very well shot, beautifully crafted, beautifully produced, beautifully edited adaptation of the Odyssey. You should watch it in the biggest screen that you can. Here in Lahore, Pakistan, I ended up watching it in Cinestar. Cinestar used to be such a good cinema up until 2024, which is when they lost their IMAX license. So basically, they still have the IMAX aspect ratio, and you still get to see the sort of like full frames whenever you're watching an IMAX film there, but you don't get it in the correct resolution. It's significantly downgraded, so it's almost a little blurry at times, and the colors seem a little off at points. And then also, they don't have the IMAX 12 channel audio. They just have 5 channel audio. Plus, like, their air conditioners don't always work, so it was kind of like hot and humid at points as well. I wouldn't say like Cinestar IMAX is like the best experience in Lahore by a long shot, but it is the place to be if you do want to ensure that you're watching an IMAX film in the correct aspect ratio and really getting the full viewing experience at least. The experience with Cinestar did take me out of it at points, but still the Odyssey is such a good film that I still had a pretty good time regardless. And I will say it's pretty hard to add something new to the Odyssey. It is such an old, important tale, but the way that Nolan really focused a lot on the traumas of war, the banality of war, and used that to add depths to Odysseus' character was very well done. The Odyssey isn't really a didactic tale as such, but you can say one of the lessons in it are about the trauma of war, and I think, you know, Nolan handled that part in particular very well. Of course, the whole spectacle of a Nolan film was there as well, so it was just a really fun cinema experience and a pretty respectable adaptation of one of the most important stories of all time. Again, I very highly recommend you watch it in the cinema, and if you have watched it already, I would love to know your thoughts on the film as well. Let me know down in the comments what you thought, where you think this ranks in terms of Nolan's wider filmography, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.